All right, welcome to HCN Live. This is our monthly opportunity for all of you to get to know the people who power High Country News. A little peek behind the curtains here at staff and board members and the folks who put the magazine together and the website together that you all support. These are events for anyone who contributes to High Country News above and beyond your subscription. So you may give 50 cents, you may give $50, you may give 50,000, but these events are really for you because it is the High Country News readers who power our work. Fully 3/4 of the revenue that pays our staff, that sends journalists out on the ground to report stories, that publishes that magazine and gets it out to you. 3/4 of that revenue comes directly from our readers, which makes this a pretty special community. My name is Greg Hanscom. I am the executive director and publisher of High Country News. And I am here with Dina Gilio-Whitaker, who is a member of, or a citizen of the Colville Confederated Tribes and a member of the High Country News Board of Directors. And Dina is a journalist and a scholar and an activist, and also the author of this book, As Long as Grass Grows, the Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. Dina, it's great to have you.
Thanks, Greg. It's great to see you, and I appreciate the invitation.
Good to be here. So I've been reading your book. It's all dog-eared and like bookmarked. And I want to preface this conversation by saying that there's so much that I want to ask you about, and an hour is not going to be sufficient. So we'll do what we can. And as I mentioned earlier, we really want to make time for questions from the audience as well. So I will, we can talk for about a half an hour, and then we'll start taking questions from viewers, folks in the audience. If you've got questions, put them in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So, well, Dina, I thought we would start with just some definitions, because there's some pretty big concepts that you work with, and you have a really unique lens on them. So can we start with environmental justice? Because I have a clear sense of environmental justice as it has been talked about for the last, I don't know, 20 or 30 years. But how is kind of your take on environmental justice different than the standard one that we hear about a lot?
Sure. So that's a great place to start, because that's definitely the starting place for my own work. And there is a standard definition, or let's say a definition that has been laid out in federal policy and law, and I'll read it to you. This is from the US EPA website. It says, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. And as I'm reading this, I realize that this is it seems to me, I haven't looked up this definition in a while, and it seems to be a little bit revised from when I first read this.
Right.
And the part that seems different to me is that the part with the bullet points, this goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys blah, blah, blah.
Right. Right.
It's a, there's a lot to say, like that's just the core definition. But basically what we can say is that the concept of environmental racism hinges or environmental justice hinges on it emphasizes, as you can tell, the concept of race and ethnicity. And so at the core of this thing that we call environmental injustice is this idea of environmental racism. And that's what I, in my research, really looked at and had needed to challenge, and if we go back to this definition, especially where it says meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, it's with that regard to national origin is a problem for American Indian people.
Yeah.
And what it does is it racializes, it relies on this idea of racializing everybody. And that's a really problematic concept for American Indian people. And so that's sort of where I built my argument in the book about environmental justice needing to be indigenized and needing to understand the history of colonialism in this country, which is based on genocide and land theft. So without acknowledging that history and the ongoing structure of settler colonialism, then it's really not, this particular definition is not going to be meaningful for American Indian people.
Right. So when I think of kind of the traditional approach to environmental justice, I think of I think of EJ communities or fence line communities. So the idea being that the burden of pollution, climate change, ecological damage falls more heavily on certain communities than it does on others. So, I think of, industrial sites that are plopped in the middle of communities of color, for example, or low-income communities, that kind of thing. Or low-income communities that are facing the brunt of climate impacts, rising seas, stronger storms, you name it. How does an indigenous approach to environmental justice look different than that?
Well, it would include all of that, because Native people do experience also disproportionate exposure to risk and harm as a result of environmental processes or development processes, toxic development, and certainly especially related to extractive industries. When we think about things like oil pipelines, and especially the history of uranium mining in the Colorado Plateau, notably in the Four Corners region, and how the Navajo Nation was exposed and still is exposed to radioactive waste as a result of that legacy of all that, mining in the 40s and 50s and earlier. So that's definitely part of it, but there is more to it than that. And as I argue, for Native people, it also has to involve or include understanding the cultural importance of certain sites and how the dispossession, historical dispossession of these kinds of sites that we could call sacred sites, and how that needs to be taken into account as well for Native people, especially when we understand that the failure of protecting sacred sites based on religious freedom, and First Amendment protections has consistently failed for Native people. And and that's because the settler system that we have, the legal system, doesn't acknowledge a very different worldview, and what we use this term epistemology, which is just basically means a knowledge system and worldview. So the Western positivist legal way that we deal with law in this country has no way of recognizing these very different worldviews. So all of that, I argue, also needs to be understood. And if we were to understand environmental justice as a process of domination and colonialism, then it would stand to reason that in the protection of sacred sites would be included. So
right. And a lot of the legal structures that are in place just are often insufficient or just not recognized. Just to give our audience an example of what you're talking about, can you take us back to 2014 to 2016 and Standing Rock, and tell us a little bit about what was brewing there?
Yeah, and this is two examples I can provide now that I've mentioned the topic of sacred site protection. So if we're talking about what is an example of how environmental injustice plays out differently for Native populations, we can look at the Standing Rock protest. First of all, to understand how that went wrong and how this was clearly a case of not just environmental racism, but we could even call it environmental colonialism, because in that example, the pipeline, right, the Dakota Access Pipeline was scheduled originally to be run by the city of Bismarck in North Dakota. And of course, Bismarck is 90% white population. Well, when the white population of Bismarck found out that this oil pipeline was coming very close to their sources of water, they moved very swiftly to reject it. And that's what happened. And so that's why it got rerouted to within a half a mile of the boundary of the Standing Rock Sioux reservation. And so that was a really clear example of, we could call it environmental racism, but again, this is beyond just, racism certainly is involved here, but it was more than that, because it didn't, we have laws in this country and around anything having to do with Native people in treaty territories, traditional treaty territories like that area. It requires what's called meaningful consultation, and that's on the federal government to meet that. And but
so this route was not on the reservation itself, but it was on treaty ground. Yeah, right. So the federal government was still required to consult.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And so there were lawsuits and all kinds of legal mechanisms that were engaged to try to get that to happen. And it didn't happen until finally Obama, on December 4th of 2016, at the 11th hour, pretty much literally, finally came out. The administration said, "Oh, we acknowledge that indeed meaningful consultation hadn't happened." And so they pulled the final permit, that allowed the drilling underneath Lake Oahe. And so that's what that stopped. That was the final piece. It was already done. Well, by then it was too late, because Trump had been elected, and everybody knew that Trump, and he'd made it really clear that once he got in office, he was going to greenlight the project ASAP. And that's what he did. His second day in office, he signed an executive order to get that thing back on track. And so
he was an investor, right? Wasn't he actually an investor in the pipeline company?
He had been an investor in ETP and Energy Transfer Partners, and they had contributed to his campaign as well. Yes. So there were all kinds of conflicts of interest there. I mean, of course, nobody talked about that, but that was a clear example of how the federal framework of consultation, even though they call it meaningful consultation, it's actually pretty meaningless consultation, because there is no real standard. And so, Native tribal communities often point out how consultation can mean anything as flimsy as a letter gets sent to the tribal council. telling them that this is happening. And so there's no agency in for tribal communities to stop anything. And so on the other hand, we have something called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which the U.S. endorsed again under the Obama administration in 2010. And we call it UNDRIP. UNDRIP, has been widely commented on by scholars, both in positive ways and in negative ways. And one of the negative critiques of it is that it really doesn't, well, for one thing, it has no teeth. It's not even a convention or a law. It's just a declaration. It has no weight, there's nothing to enforce anything. So, or ways to implement it even. But one of the things that it does, and in my opinion, the most important thing that it enshrines is the right to free, prior, and informed consent about projects that impact tribal indigenous communities. And the federal government they in theory endorse that. They stand by it. But there was nowhere was that ever invoked or respected. And if the U.S. actually took its responsibility seriously, there would have been a process of not just consultation, but consent, where the tribe would have, been given the power to say yes or no, but clearly that didn't happen. And, I think it was in their interest not to, because the tribe was really clear from the very beginning that they didn't agree with it and they wouldn't endorse it. So there's that example. And then there's the second example, going back to what I was saying about the protection of
Hey, Dina, let me jump in here super quick. Hold on to that second example. We have 101 people who've joined us. Thank you. I just wanted to let everyone know that this is HCN Live. I'm Greg Hanscom, Executive Director and Publisher, and I'm here with Dina Gilio-Whitaker, scholar, author, activist, and one of my bosses as one of the members of the High Country News Board of Directors. So glad you could be here. We're going to be chatting for another 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to start taking questions from the audience. If you've got questions, put them in the chat, and we'll do our very best to get as many as we possibly can. So sorry, Dina, sorry to interrupt. Go on.
No worries. So this, going back to this topic of the protecting of sacred sites, the reason that that's important is because so much land has been taken and let's be clear, literally stolen, and has become, either privately owned or, protected as, so-called public lands, with national parks and BLM land and, state parks, things like that. So that's why we need to have a conversation about, what it means to protect the integrity of the environment of those sites. When I wrote the book, I had done the study. Well, the book emerges from a graduate research project, a master's thesis project that looked at an example here in the town where I live in coastal Southern California, where a tribe, and it was a perfect example to study this because it involved a tribe that's not federally recognized. They have no land base. They have effectively, they have no real legal rights at all to protect sites that are important to them. This particular site is located on a marine base, Camp Pendleton Marine Base, leased out to a state park that's a campground, and right next to a nuclear power plant. And so there's all these really weird complications and jurisdictional issues. And so it was an ideal site to study, to talk about all the complexities of protecting native sacred sites, especially, among the least powerful. And so in this case, the point of it was that, and why I studied, is because the site did get protected from the building of a toll road going through it. Nobody wanted this toll road except the company that owns the toll roads, and so it galvanized a really diverse group of activists and stakeholders, from environmentalists to surfers, to a grassroots group of tribal people, and so that's what it took for the tribe to get this sacred site, this ancient and 10,000-year-old village site, that was be deemed eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. That's how important and recognized this site is. And so, but because they had no legal rights to protect it, what they had to do was to join coalition, like to join in coalitional power, environmentalists and surfers, to get the site protected. And so ultimately, the governing body that had the power to deny the development, the building permit for this road, did deny it. And one of the reasons that they denied it was a really strong, it could have been the pivotal reason, was the fact that it was a Native American sacred site. And there was a recognition that for Native people, like, you can't move sacred sites like you can move a church, or you can move a mosque, or whatever. And that was exactly the language that this commissioner used. And so she got it, and it seeped into her consciousness, like, this is a really important reason to protect this site. And so because she recognized that in the legal landscape there was no other way. There's no way to protect these sites if it's not reservation land.
Yeah. It seems like the significance there, and you tell that story in your book, you tell it really well, is that, well, a couple of things, right? One of them is the coalition. So it brought together conservationists, surfers, indigenous people. So it was this really sort of remarkable group of people that came together. And part of it, and as you say, it seems like the other really big moment was that the California Coastal Coalition looked at this proposed freeway and said,
Toll road.
Oh, right. Okay.
It wasn't even a freeway.
Not free. Not free.
Right,
yeah.
not free. No,
right,
you have to pay to drive on these things.
Yeah. So, and they said this thing is going to go, directly adjacent, right, to this.
Pretty much on top of. I mean, within 20 feet of it. I mean, let's be real about it.
Yeah.
Much on it.
And that realization, like, you cannot replace that, nor can you move it.
You can't.
It is actually tied to this particular piece of ground, this particular spot on this earth.
Burial ground on top of it.
Yeah. I know. So, and was there also an acknowledgement there of tribal sovereignty? And maybe it's worth just pausing to talk a little bit about sovereignty. My understanding of sovereignty in theory is that, tribes are the third sovereigns in this country. You've got the federal government, you got the state government, and then you have tribes. And that sovereignty is fundamental to Native people's rights to protecting land. Have I got that right? And did that come into play?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And no, it didn't, because they're not federally recognized.
Okay.
Sovereignty is only a right reserved for federally recognized tribes. Those are the people that have an actual political relationship to the United States. And this is why it was such an important site to study, because this tribe lack all of that. They're ultimately pretty powerless. The only real power they had was a couple of state laws protecting cultural property, and that the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, was obligated to look at. And so that's why it was an issue for the California Coastal Commission, the permitting body. And so that's why it was able to come in at all. So, there was a little bit of, protection, legal kind of a thin layer of legal protection, but that was it. And it was still up to the Coastal Commission because there was no tribal sovereignty there.
Right. Now, in the case of Standing Rock, and I have to say that I am really just getting my head around how significant Standing Rock was in so many ways. We had a great HCN Live months back with our Indigenous Affairs desk editor, Nick Martin, and staff writer, Brian Oster. And both of them talked about how the Standing Rock incident was really formative for them as journalists. I mean, a lot of people may remember the just the shocking scenes of militarized police coming in with Humvees and water cannons, rubber bullets, chasing the occupiers out of the area. But that was a big moment. But so for the Standing Rock Sioux, they had sovereign rights, right? But it still didn't.
It wasn't enough because the federal government didn't follow its own laws for meaningful consultation. Or so, that's to show the point about that is how flimsy federal laws are around tribal sovereignty and engaging it. In fact, I mean, there's a whole conversation there about what does it actually mean? What is tribal sovereignty? And it's multifaceted. But one of in the negative aspect of it is that ultimately it's still what Tyagi Alfred the scholar Tyagi Alfred has called a delegated form of sovereignty. It's not the same kind of sovereignty that nation states have with each other or for themselves. This is a form of sovereignty that has been defined effectively by the Supreme Court in the 19th century, during a time of very aggressive, domination against tribal people. And so basically we have a legal system that has been shaped by these very archaic eras. And it's been argued that it's still pretty racist against Native people, and that's ultimately true. But again, I think it's more than that. It's more about when we can't continue to understand the relationship of the United States to tribal nations in these racialized terms. It all began as a process of domination based on an idea of cultural and religious, ultimately, inferiority. Because, if we think about the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of discovery is at the root of all of this, of all federal Indian law. It's the first doctrine to ever be articulated in the canon of federal Indian law. And so the doctrine of discovery is all about how Native people are not racially different, but how they're culturally and religiously inferior and in needing of civilization because of it. So,
right. Well, and you point out in your book that this led to a campaign not just of genocide, but just erasure, right? So you have this amazing line in your book when you're talking about the creation of the national parks and wilderness areas, and you say, in order to create the national parks and wilderness areas, I think you say uninhabited landscapes first had to be created.
Yeah, and that's directly from Mark Spence.
Okay.
And so just to be clear, like I didn't think, but that to me was like, aha, like a light bulb, like, wow, and that he recognized that, back when he published his book in 1998 or 99 or whenever it was, quite a while ago. But yeah, I mean, when that's a critique about this thing that we call this idea that we have about what wilderness is in this country, and how a wilderness is understood as a place of an unpeopled landscape, a place where wilderness is a place where there are no people, the way that it's been perpetuated. And so that's what he was raising that point, like, there has never been any place in this country that was an unpeopled landscape. It was all peopled, and there were millions of indigenous people here when Europeans started arriving. So that's what that's saying.
Right, right, yeah. I could ask you questions all day, but I want to take some questions from the audience. If you are just joining us, we've got 107 here. Good to have you. I'm Greg Hanscom. I'm the executive director and publisher of High Country News. And this is HCN Live with Dina Gilio-Whitaker, who is a citizen of the Colville Confederated Tribes and a member of HCN's board of directors. And I'm going to really try to sort of stick to reader questions as much as I can, because last time we didn't get many of them, and there's some really good questions here. Let me start. Let's see. Okay. We've got Michael talking about Oak Flat and a story that Mother Jones actually published recently about, can the U.S. go green without destroying sacred native lands? An Apache group is fighting to stop a massive copper mine in Arizona. And Dina, you and I have talked about this as well. The push to electrify cars, to turn to green energy, has real implications for native lands. How can we shift to a clean economy and take the rights and perspectives of native people into account?
Well, you have to understand, you have to look really closely at what are the sources. What does green energy mean? I mean, ultimately, it still relies. I mean, if we're talking about green energy, we're talking about, renewables, we're talking about battery technology, requires, because we don't want to compromise our energy intensive society. And that, I have a critique about that, but nobody wants to give anything up, right? I mean, they want to give up fossil fuels, but they don't want to give up their cars, and we don't want to give up our high energy, our high technology society. And so that means, still relying on technology for, storing electricity. And this really comes down to batteries, and even the sources of power, like, wind and solar. There are examples of, wind generation projects that have, profoundly impacted native communities. I'm thinking about the Ocotillo wind farm here in Southern California that was built a little over 10 years ago now. This was again authorized by the Obama administration. And this was to be built, this massive wind project on public lands. It was all appropriated land from, and in California, it's all stolen land, all of it. Every inch of the land here is stolen, because there were treaties, but none of them were even ratified. So all of this land, we can't even say it's contested. It's just stolen. And so there was a big consortium of tribes that came together to oppose this wind project. And they were run over roughshod. They were completely ignored. Because there were sensitive cultural sites out there, but they were ignored, and the wind project was built anyway. The same is true. We're looking at, the Thacker Pass mine, this proposed lithium mine in Nevada. That is, if you look at of course, High Country News has done some of the best investigative work on that. And this is still an unfolding story. And it's been recognized that, there have been no processes of consultation with any of the tribal communities, namely Fort McDermott. That's a federally recognized tribe within, I think, 25 miles of that place. And lithium mining is intensely, as an extractive industry, it's really bad for the environment. I mean, It's, has processes, as I understand it, similar to fracking. I mean, you have to use a lot of groundwater. There's a lot of sulfuric acid, I think, that they need. So chemicals, intensive chemicals to do this. It's a really dirty process. Um, you know, let's recall what happened in Bolivia. The only indigenous president in the world, Evo Morales, was basically endured a coup, ultimately because Bolivia is said to have the largest reserves of lithium in the world, and they've been developing it, but they nationalized it. And so anytime a country nationalizes a resource like that, it's, companies don't like that. It cuts into their profits. It complicates things for them. And so, we had a coup against Evo Morales because of it. And we see, I'll never forget it. I'll never forgive Elon Musk for this, because, he tweeted out that we will coup. And he actually pretty much admits that the U.S. supported this coup in Bolivia to get rid of Evo Morales. He says, we'll coup against whoever we want.
Yeah.
And, that's, so we have to think about all of these things, whenever you're talking about, industry, even renewable and energy industries, you have to look at the environmental processes involved. Just because we call it green energy doesn't mean it's actually a green process.
Yeah. We've got Michael chiming in with a quote from Dr. Hunter Lovins, and I don't have a link to where this came from, but the quote is, "It is wholly disingenuous to call this copper mine, needed for a transition to renewables. The world's biggest copper mine is under the streets of New York City. All the copper wires no longer needed for phones. Mine the landfills and waste heaps." I love that. God, I'm jumping around here a little bit. There's a long comment here from Karen, who's gotten into your book, Dina, and has also read Deep Medicine and The Anatomy of Injustice. And Karen is feeling inflamed, angry about all of this stuff, and talks about how difficult it is to digest some of this. California, stolen land, a country built on genocide and erasure. This really rocks people's worlds. And I wonder if, I wonder if you, let me ask you this. You've really leaned on High Country News to go beyond being anti-racist and to talk about how High Country News can be actually anti-colonial. Can you talk to me about what that looks like? Because Karen's question is really, how do we make a difference? When faced with this horrendous history, how do we move forward? What does it look like to start to decolonize this region, the Western United States?
Well, what it looks like is centering land in your analysis, and the long not just land, but the long history of habitation, and who was displaced in order for all of this civilization, so-called, a bad word, let's say the new settler societies to be built. What we have become used to in this country, especially on the left, like the political left and social justice work, is centering a racial analysis. And that's I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. I'm saying that it's an incomplete analysis. We need we can't say, because that hinges on an idea that the big, I call it the original sin narrative, like the original sin narrative, like the original sin of the United States. We often hear this is slavery, is racism. But, that was only one part of one pillar of a twin pillar process. Because if you look, and this is what I'm writing about in my new book, deconstructing all of this, and this has been a focus of a lot of the work I'm doing right now as a scholar and teacher, is understanding that colonialism is a process of white supremacy. And here I'm going to recommend the film Exterminate All the Brutes. This was a 4-hour documentary by the Black Haitian filmmaker Raoul Peck. Raoul Peck is known for his most recent film before that called I Am Not Your Negro. So in this remarkable film series, Peck takes us through, completely deconstructs white supremacy, but connects it to the history of settler colonialism in over the last 500 years. And so we have to understand, and there's more and more scholarship saying, really understanding racism as we know it is really being a result of colonialism. So rather than the other way around, like colonialism is not a result of racism, it's racism is created by colonialism.
That tool. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's certainly, if we look at the federal Indian law, that really is a piece of it. And again, it's like federal Indian law, it didn't start, the domination paradigm of it doesn't start with racial discrimination. It's all about land. That's what we talk about, the settler project, right? Settler colonialism has always been about land. Land is its irreducible element, as Patrick Wolf said. It's always about, getting the land at any cost. And that's what it's done. So once we center land in our analysis, then we can talk about the processes of dispossession that allowed the U.S. to really happen. And so a decolonial ethic really has to begin with that, the original sin, of colonialism and genocide and land theft.
So many questions, and we have a lot of great comments coming in. We've got James saying this country was built on stolen capital, land, and stolen labor, slavery.
Twin processes.
Yeah. Some folks pointing to, good HCN article yesterday. This is Michael, about free, prior, and informed consent is the gold standard for Indigenous rights. Why isn't it followed? Maybe that's a good sort of jumping off point for you, Dina, in terms of efforts that you know about to strengthen tribal sovereign rights. Are there ways that we can, and are you seeing progress, state governments that are taking these sovereign rights more seriously and maybe even writing it into policy?
Yeah, and it's a good conversation, because I would say yes and no. So it's complicated. And I'll say on the positive side that I am seeing activity around that. As to Michael's question about free, prior, and informed consent, why isn't it followed? Why? Because it gives tribes veto power. It gives them too much power. But what amazes me is that it took over 20 years for UNDRIP to get created, because it was too much for states. So and what we have now is a very, very watered down version. But that free, prior, and informed consent, how that stayed in there, I don't know, because consent is a lot of power. And that's
so that would have been the power to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Yeah. So right, so that's what, so that there's that. But to your other question about what's happening in, moving in a good direction, is something that is happened in November. So we have the Biden administration has been, elevated environmental justice to being really a core part of his approach to environmental, like the 30 by 30 plan, for example. Not that that's all great for Native people, because it's not, but at least having, he did form a White House Council on Environmental Justice. There are 27 people on that council. 2 of them are Native people, really important Native scholars and activists. And so in November, the White House issued and I'll put this in the chat, they issued a statement that commits to elevating Indigenous knowledge in federal policy decisions. This is interesting. It's good, but it does raise some big questions. Something also happened similarly in the state of California here in February, where a bill was introduced actually by an assemblyman in San Diego. And it's a very similar initiative, and about using traditional ecological knowledge, incorporating it in the state's conservation and land management practices. And it actually does use the term free, prior, and informed consent, which I think is interesting. But again, the bill is only introduced, it's not passed. It's, there's a long way to go, and it can change a lot. So, for the better or for the worst. So, so these are interesting things. We also in California have a truth and reconciliation process that's ongoing, that's only the second in the country relative to Indigenous people. The state of Maine had a truth and reconciliation, but California's efforts are going, what it looks like to me is it's way beyond what the state of Maine has done, because it's in California, it's more broad based. So some of the actions that have been taken so far include allocating $100 million to repatriating land to tribal, federally and non-federally recognized tribes. So that's a step in the right direction. Another thing that happened just this last week was an announcement that the UC system will incorporate tuition-free as Native students. California Indian and Native American students will be able to go to UC schools without tuition.
You're kidding. Wow. Has that actually
passed?
That's the thing.
Yeah, it's actually passed. It's a problem though, that because it only is limited to people from federally recognized tribes, like enrolled members of federally recognized tribes, and it doesn't include at least right now, it doesn't include California Indians from non-federally recognized tribes, and it also doesn't include descendants, and that's an issue. There are a lot of people in this country who are registered descendants who qualify for federal services, even though they're not enrolled members of their tribes. And so that will be a fight that will have to be engaged too. Now, getting onto this other point that I was going to make on the negative side, what we're seeing is challenges right now to the framework of tribal sovereignty through challenges to the Indian Child Welfare Act. This is something called the Brackeen case. It's been in the courts for several years now. It follows on the heels of the Baby Veronica case, for those of you who were following that in 2013. This is part of a broader challenge coming from the conservative right, and the Goldwater Institute, who is working to dismantle tribal sovereignty by dismantling the Indian Child Welfare Act, because conservatives feel it gives tribes too much power. And So by attacking and, striking down either in whole or in part, some of the important elements of the Indian Child Welfare Act can very realistically lead to the dismantling of tribal sovereignty altogether. And so that's a challenge. The Supreme Court just a few weeks ago announced that it would hear this Brackeen case.
Okay.
And so then this is really a very, very dangerous moment if we think about the composition of the Supreme Court right now, with a super majority, conservative super majority.
So in the Indian Child Welfare Act provides protections for tribal nations. And basically sets some policies in place around adopting non-Indigenous folks, adopting Native kids, right? So this is protections for tribal nations and for tribal kids. The right is going after this, and if they manage to
funded by big oil, let's be clear. So there are environmental components to this that we need to look at too, about some of the where some of the funding is coming from to fight this law. And especially when you recognize that a huge percentage of natural resources are still on tribal lands that have a certain amount of protection. So there are reasons for big business to be working to against this framework.
Yeah. So if you can punch a hole in tribal sovereignty via the Indian Child Welfare Act,
yep,
you're going to be able to punch more holes into it when you want to go and develop oil and gas or uranium, or you have it on native lands.
Yep. Got it.
Another question. We're coming up to the top of the hour, but we do have a question from Barry. Says, thanks for your work. Wonders if you have a take on the book, The Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth. Is that one you're familiar with?
Yeah. I mean, I was, those are all colleagues and friends. I was there at the beginning of the founding of the Red Nation. So the Red Nation is, an activist organization started by former classmates and colleagues of mine at the University of New Mexico. And so I've been following, their work for the several years that they have been in existence with amazement, how things have built and evolved for their efforts. The Red Deal is a pretty radical vision for what justice in this country looks like. For not just Native people, but it makes the case that Indigenous liberation, and that's the language that they use, liberation is tied to the liberation of other people, especially the most marginalized, like Black communities and others. So and that it's also tied to the liberation of the environment. So it makes the connections, it connects the dots between all these other social justice or numerous other social justice projects in the US. And I think it's really powerful. And I think it's great.
You've got another line in your book about, there's an old saying that Native people are the canary in the coal mine. We're all the canary in the coal mine now.
Felix Cohen was he wrote about that in his book, Handbook on Indian, I can't remember, the Handbook on Federal Indian Law, I think it's called, from the 1940s. So he was not a Native person, he was a lawyer who understood federal Indian law and was very influential. And that's what he said, they're the miners and the canaries in the mine, meaning what happens to Native people, Indian people, it can kind of be a precursor to what happens to everybody else eventually. I think that's what he meant.
Yeah. Well, you make a very powerful case that that we're all in this together now, and that Native people hold a lot of answers that we desperately need right now. Um,
Mhm.
so, and I have to say, I think it's probably time to wrap it up, but I do want to say that I've just been blown away by the work that is being done right now by Indigenous scholars like yourself, Dina, but also Native activists, journalists. Um, it just feels like a groundswell to me, and I think at High Country News we're deeply committed to covering that groundswell as journalists. I think we're also deeply committed to empowering that and enabling that by supporting Indigenous journalists, and by continuing to be a training ground and a proving ground for Native journalists, and a place where folks can come and do their best work.
Yeah, and that's why I'm a board member, because I totally acknowledge that and I respect it, and I think that High Country News is really doing the cutting edge work around this kind of stuff, understanding the importance of sovereignty and this bigger framework of colonialism and thinking decolonially, because that's what we need to do, and I appreciated you asking that question, like how do we shift that paradigm? This is what it means to think decolonially, and that's the goal, like,
Yeah.
is to think not just anti-racially but decolonially.
Right. Right. I love it. You're pushing us in the best ways, Dina. We are so lucky to have you on the board and just as part of the High Country News family. Um, really appreciate it. And thank you so much to everyone who tuned in today. We had more than 100 people at one point sort of tuned in for this conversation. You all are the folks who really keep High Country News going. Again, 3/4 of the revenue that pays our bills, that pays the journalists to go out and do the important work, comes directly from our readers in the form of subscription dues and donations. So thank you. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for being here. And stay tuned for more. It's funny, I'm seeing links in the comments to stories that we've got up on our website that I even haven't had a chance to read yet. So the good work continues. Thank you all so much for being
So
here.
much great stuff in the chat. I
I
wish we had
know.
more time to talk about all of this.
I
So much
know.
I want to respond to, but I know we don't have time.
I know. Well, we will have a record of everything that's in the chat, and I'll share that with you, Dina, and maybe we can respond to a couple of these comments at least after the
Yeah, I
fact.
saw somebody say something about the Midnight Mine up in Washington, and I wanted to say to acknowledge that. I actually do write about that in the book. And that's right, that's in my homeland territory, so you have ongoing contamination of the Columbia River, and the region, people on the Spokane Reservation who are still suffering disproportionate, much like radiation contamination in their bodies and the land, like the Navajo Nation. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there.
More work to do.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks,
Well,
Greg.
great. Thank you, Dina. Thanks for being here. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and a good weekend.
Bye.
Take care.